One of the biggest shadows hanging over modern Buddhism in every form, Mahayana and Theravada, is the idea that what is more ancient is more rational. And this is something that you may have seen discussed directly in academic articles, but even if you haven't seen it really addressed straight on, it's really kind of lurking in the background of a lot of what gets said about the history of Buddhism, and when people are trying to establish what is and what isn't a legitimate or definitive part of Buddhist philosophy. Anyone who states that clearly, it's already like a bad joke. You're already talking about something that's just so ridiculous, you can't really believe anyone would take it seriously. If we're talking about the history of ancient Greece, does anyone start with the assumption that whatever is more ancient is more rational, is more pure, is more definitive? No. Ancient Greece, if you're going to really get serious about Greek philosophy, you're going to find totally crazy, superstitious, magical beliefs in every era of that history. And if anything, I think a lot of people would feel that when you go back to the earlier period, things get a little bit worse. Never heard anyone talk about ancient Egypt or even ancient China with that sense that whatever is more ancient is going to be more rational. But this is a huge preconception that's foisted onto Buddhism. It's been talked about in a couple of my articles. Obviously, this is going to be a much more short and straightforward answer to the question. What is the association between rationality and earlier level of the text? Well, okay, to play devil's advocate for half a second here, in the 19th century, when Europeans were colonizing Asia at a much more rapid rate than ever before, although they already had many centuries of colonialism behind them, and when publishing in Europe had really opened up to presenting a lot of things that before would have been censored or just would have never gotten published, the Buddhism that they encountered in the field was obviously very much involved in ritual and very much mixed up with Hindu ideas, ideas that weren't uniquely Buddhist, ideas that stem from local religious traditions. So, you know, to play devil's advocate, from the colonial perspective in the 19th century, you start off with a prejudice that makes sense, but it is just an irrational prejudice. Okay, there's what the normal peasants do, and then there's a written canon of texts. And the written canon, obviously, coming from a Christian perspective, there was an assumption that the written canon would contain the definitive philosophy of the religion, in contrast to the very diverse rituals that they would have encountered in places from Tibet to Sri Lanka. And, you know, I mean, Buddhism in the 19th century in Tibet included human sacrifice. If Europeans were asking this question, well, is human sacrifice really a legitimate part of Buddhism? Is meat eating a legitimate part of Buddhism? Is having sacred cows a legitimate part of Buddhism? Or is that Hindu influence? Those kinds of questions, when they were first digging into it, obviously they had to look around to try to establish what were the ancient texts. Those texts became available to Europeans remarkably late. If you look at a philosopher like Arthur Schopenhauer, who was very influential over the Europeans who became the first real scholars of Buddhism, Schopenhauer had access to almost nothing. He had a few little bits and pieces that managed to make it over from the study of Buddhism in China and Japan. And that's a whole other story for a different discussion. But 1874 is when one of the first big chunks of Pali text gets presented to Europe. And that's the description of the death of the Buddha, called the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. Mahaparinibbana Sutta is published in 1874, not in English, just in Pali. And, I mean, 1874, it may sound like ancient history, but if you think about the history of philosophy in Europe generally, I mean, it's remarkably late in the game that becomes available. And the guy who did the hard work of making that available was a guy named R.C. Childers. And Childers, if anyone knows that name, it's because he wrote a dictionary for Pali, a very imperfect dictionary, but it was the first dictionary that made it easier, a lot easier to do this kind of work. And that came out the next year in 1875. Okay, so that's a big turning point in the life of the first big famous name in the history of Theravada Buddhist studies, who's still one of the most influential authors in Buddhism, and that is Mr. Rhys Davids. I've written several essays that attack and criticize Rhys Davids, and there's a lot wrong with his work. There's a lot that's worth criticizing. There's a lot that's still worth debating and discussing today. But starting from Childers' work, he translated the Mahaparinibbana Sutta into English, and then he brings out the first real volume-length work. I mean, Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the description of the Buddha's death, it's like a short novel or a long short story in length. But what Rhys Davids brings out is the first volume of the Digha Nikaya. So that is a book-length collection of texts. And that's tremendously influential. And that's influential not just from the date of the translation, but from the date of the first publication of the Pali. And that's 1889. Now again, 1889, it's not all that long ago. Thinking about intellectual and philosophical response to Buddhism, there just hasn't been that much time, not that many scholars, not that many influential authors in the game. If you actually go to an archive and get a first edition of that 1889 Digha Nikaya, although it's in Pali, it's in a language very few people can read, what he did was he translated a one-sentence summary in English for each page, and that made it a lot more accessible. People who had a little bit of a background in some other Indian language, whether that was Sanskrit or modern Indian language, Marathi or Marathi Prakrit, there were enough people around who could muddle through that text, especially in the way it was presented, because it was really made easier by having a one-sentence summary for each page to let you find what you were looking for, give you an idea what was going on, and then you could sit down and deal with the ancient text. And anyway, English translations came out in the decades after of the full text. So that opened the door onto Theravada Buddhism and a sense of canonical and, quote-unquote authentic Buddhism for Europeans that was easy to get at. It was on a bookshelf. It was a bound book with a cover. It wasn't a trunk full of handwritten palm leaf manuscripts in a language nobody could understand. Okay, so coming back to the fundamental question I'm asking here, why would people regard what is more ancient as more authentic? Well, I mentioned the kind of colonial background of what people saw in the village and at the temple in terms of ritual and superstitious beliefs. And then we have these two landmark texts coming out. Mahaparinibbana Sutta, this one sutta describing the death of the Buddha and the events leading up to the death of the Buddha, it lends itself to this kind of perspective. The nature of the text is heavily laden with supernatural imagery. Magical things happen throughout the text. And for people from a Christian background, they say, okay, this looks like a text that's been sort of corrupted and embellished and has had legend added to it. And on the other hand, you can see human aspects of it shining through. I'll come back to a little bit about what that is. I could put up a whole YouTube video just talking about that sutta. There's a lot to say about it still today. But the contrast was between the narrative of the Buddha's death, and the next big landmark is Digha Nikaya Volume 1, first volume of Digha Nikaya. Well, guess what? The Digha Nikaya, which is a major collection of Buddhist philosophical texts, including also some not so philosophical texts, but stories that form the Buddhist tradition. It's not arranged in random order. It is actually arranged thematically. And the first volume of the Digha Nikaya, as it happens, is about morality. So it doesn't open with nearly as much supernatural material. It doesn't open with material about cosmology. Ancient Buddhists, just like ancient Greeks, had a complex and very magical view of what the world was. There's a magical mountain at the center of the world in that ancient Indian cosmology that's in many ways like Mount Olympus. There are wars between gods and demons. There are ghosts. There's heaven and hell. It's a very, this is mythology. And the whole Pali Canon is heavily laden with mythology. But as it happens, what was the first part of the canon that really opened the door for Europeans to look at this material? And in contrast to the narrative of the Buddha's death, the answer is, it happened to be the first volume of the Digha Nikaya. Now, to cut things short, I'm only talking about a couple of historical figures. People were really inspired by this, and this reinforced the tendency to think, okay, there's a more rational, less supernatural, original core to these texts. It's not true. In case you're not getting the foreshadowing here, this is really a misconception that Europeans brought to bear. But an example of a person who was really inspired by the publishing of the Digha Nikaya was the woman who became Mr. Rhys-Davids' wife. So I normally call her Mrs. Rhys-Davids to avoid confusion. Her name is given as C.A.F. Rhys-Davids. She really got very inspired by her husband's work, and you can read her sense of disappointment with almost every Buddhist text that she encounters in her career, because she was comparing it to the expectations she had that were based, on the two texts I've already mentioned. She worked for a very long time on Abhidhamma texts. I'm not going to explain what that is. It's a different section of the canon, and you can read both in her articles and in her introductions to the books her sense of total disappointment and dismay. She was expecting to find a kind of perfect rational philosophy when she dug into these ancient texts, and then she's horrified at what she finds. Even the Samyutta Nikaya, so the Nikayas are major sections of Buddhist texts, even when she was working on that, you have this sense of dismay from her, including in the introductions to her books, to her volumes on that subject. So a whole generation of people had a set of expectations that they probably brought to Buddhism anyway, just as sheer prejudice, confirmed by what happened to be the leading scholarship of the time, just in the years leading right up to the 20th century. This is at the ragged end of the 19th century. What's my date for first translation of Digha Nikaya? The whole thing into English is 1899. So to call it 19th century, the 19th century was running out of time. There's a lot more I could say about this, and a lot of it's discussed in a longer view in my essay, The Opposite of Buddhism, that goes back several centuries and then focuses on more ethical issues. And some of these issues are discussed from a more practical perspective in another very long essay called Canon and Reason. That is coming out both in Chinese and in English. The second Chinese translation is supposed to be done next week. But what's the cultural background, really briefly? Why is it that Europeans have come to this with these expectations? When you look at certain flashpoints in the history of Christianity in the 19th century, I think that one of the major cultural trends of that century that's now forgotten, because it's not as controversial anymore, it's not as emotive, was the passion to try to reread the Bible and to establish a sense of the historical Jesus within Christianity. Now, yeah, if you search within YouTube right now, you can see people who are still passionate about those issues. To some extent, the controversy is still going on. Thomas Jefferson wrote his version of the Bible in 1819. That's what's called the Jefferson Bible. What do you mean? Someone might ask, what do you mean he wrote his own Bible? Well, it's pretty much literally that. He actually took a knife and scissors and he cut up the Bible. And he literally cut out the parts he didn't like and sewed together the parts he did like, and he produced a version of the Bible that removed all of the supernatural material. Now, Thomas Jefferson was wealthy and powerful enough that he could get away with this. He was not going to be censored, he was not going to be tortured by any kind of church authority. And in the 19th century, the nature of censorship was changing. Just a few centuries before, people in Europe, you'd have to really be afraid for your life to do something like this. And even within the US, the whole history of the witch trials and what have you. And many of the outstanding atheists and freethinkers, you know, in Europe's history that we have any evidence for, were also aristocrats or powerful people politically who could get away with asking the questions they asked. Thinking of a pair of figures, Holbach and Helvetius, they wrote one of the most influential pamphlets on atheism in the years leading up to the revolution in France, the first French Revolution. They've had a few since then, you might have noticed. You know, this tendency of wanting to find something more rational by looking within the Bible among many people who didn't really want to make the leap to outright atheism, but who wanted to kind of maintain a connection with Christianity as a religion while basically rejecting the notion that Jesus came back from the dead. That was a tremendous cultural movement, and it found a kind of lit fuse in the controversy over the ending of the Gospel of Mark. That controversy was known for more than 500 years. It was basically known from early medieval times. But the ending of Mark chapter 16, in the 18th century and the 19th century, it became a little more possible for people to discuss and chat about the fact that there really was evidence that the ending of that particular book of the Bible originally did not include the resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus dies and he's put in a tomb and that's it. He stays dead. He doesn't come back from the dead. Now, that sort of factoid in isolation, if it was just a kind of footnote in the history of Christianity, it wouldn't be a big deal. But a lot of people today underestimate how many people, for many centuries, didn't want to reject Christianity entirely, but wanted a less narrow religion that they could continue to be a part of. So, the short answer is, in the 19th century, this tremendous cultural impetus to find the historical Buddha, and the assumption that the historical Buddha is more rational than any other Buddha you want to think about. That doesn't just have a parallel in what was going on with the historical Jesus. It's an intersection. They really are the same kind of quest. And that's one of the reasons why this was so influential within Asia. This is by no means an exclusively European phenomenon. As soon as European scholars and Asian scholars were working together, which is really the whole history of European scholarship, they relied a great deal on cooperation from local monks, local translators, local specialists. You know, for the same reasons why many Christians didn't want to just become atheists. There were many Buddhists who didn't want to reject Buddhism entirely, but it was tremendously appealing for them to imagine that there was a non-mystical, non-supernatural historical Buddha to be discovered inside the pages of the most ancient sutras in the Pali Canon. Okay, I think I've said a lot for one YouTube video. Human attention span is what it is. You know, in case I haven't stated it explicitly enough, the problem with this thesis is that it's just not true. And in what sense is it not true? If you told me that the real Plato or the real Socrates or the real Herodotus, three different thinkers from ancient Greece, if you told me that the real original philosophy of these people contained no superstition, nothing magical, I would say bullshit. I can imagine emotional reasons why someone might want to believe that. You might want to think that the greatest philosophies of ancient Greece, or that if you dig into pre-Socratic philosophy, that they'll be atheistic, rationalistic, or scientific in their outlook. But we know, anyone who wants to do the reading can know that's not true. You know, and one of the things that makes ancient Greek philosophy exciting is the tension that exists between skeptical sources and sources that really embrace not just superstition, but a magical view of the world that reflects all the fears and ignorance and hallucinations that people had, you know, in a much more primitive and desperate time. I think, you know, to try to end with something positive, because that's a bit bleak as an end note, you know, if you don't respect that when you're reading ancient texts, if you feel compelled to censor hell and ghosts and demons, to cut them out of the Bible the same way Thomas Jefferson did, then you should not be a scholar of any ancient religion. You shouldn't work on ancient Greece, you shouldn't work on Buddhism or anything else. And if you have the attitude, basically a sympathetic attitude, that these books were written by human beings and reflect their culture and their attitudes at that time, then you can be a scholar. And it's not even that hard to make exciting and original discoveries working with these texts, because so few people have worked with them. And as I mentioned, in a lot of ways this opened up to Western involvement, ancient involvement, just in a little more than 100 years. Okay.